19 people hanged, one man pressed to death under heavy stones, somewhere between 150 and 200 people locked in colonial jails, several dying there before any trial, and the accused included a 71-year-old grandmother who had been a church member for decades, a farmer who challenged the court's logic openly, and a former minister who recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly at the foot of the gallows, something the prosecution had argued no genuine witch could do. The crowd watching that execution went quiet. The minister hanged anyway. What made that possible is not what most people were taught. I want to start with what the court records, examination transcripts, and colonial correspondence actually show, not Arthur Miller's play, not the ergot poisoning theory that circulates online, not the idea of mass hysteria that makes the whole thing sound like a medical event rather than a human one. The surviving documents from 1992 are extensive enough to tell a disturbing story on their own, and that story is considerably darker than the version most of us learned, because it does not end with a simple explanation. What it shows instead is a community of people who believe they were acting rationally, an illegal machine they built that could not stop feeding on itself. The popular version of Salem usually begins with girls, specifically with teenage girls caught doing something forbidden, dancing in the woods, dabbling in fortune-telling, who then fabricated witchcraft accusations to escape punishment and dragged an entire community into catastrophe through lies and performance. That version has real cultural power. It gives the story a clear cause, a clear group of villains, and a satisfying, if disturbing, explanation for how something so extreme could happen. Arthur Miller's 1953 play The Crucible shaped a generation's understanding of 1992. And while Miller was using Salem as an allegory for McCarthyism, his version entered popular memory as though it were documentary history. The problem is that the actual documented beginning looked nothing like that. In January 1992, two children in the Salem Village household of Reverend Samuel Parris began exhibiting symptoms that no one around them could explain. Betty Parris was 9 years old. Her cousin Abigail Williams was 11. The fits they experienced, convulsions, contortions, screaming, periods where they seemed unable to speak or move, were witnessed by adults and were disturbing enough that Parris sought medical help. The physician who examined them, according to later accounts, could find no natural cause and reportedly suggested the girls might be suffering from what contemporaries called an evil hand. That phrase carried precise meaning in 1692 Massachusetts. It meant supernatural affliction. It meant witchcraft. What happened next is where the story immediately becomes more complicated than the popular version allows. A neighbor named Mary Sibley, concerned and apparently drawing on folk beliefs that circulated alongside official Puritan theology, instructed Parris's enslaved workers, a woman named Tituba and her husband John Indian, to prepare what was called a witch cake. The recipe used rye meal and urine from the afflicted girls, and it was fed to a dog. The logic behind this counter magic was that identifying or harming the witch responsible would break the affliction. Parris, when he learned of it, was furious. He condemned the experiment from his pulpit. But the attempt itself is worth pausing on, because it tells you something important about the world these people inhabited. The response to a possible supernatural attack was not to dismiss the supernatural, but to fight it on its own terms, using methods that had circulated through folk tradition for generations. The boundary between official Puritan theology and popular folk belief was blurrier in practice than Puritan ministers liked to admit. By late February, the circle of afflicted young people had widened. Ann Putnam Jr., Elizabeth Hubbard, and others were reporting fits and claiming they could see invisible figures attacking them. On February 29, 1692, formal complaints were filed against 3 women, Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne. I want you to look at who these 3 people were, because the selection matters enormously for understanding what comes next. Tituba was enslaved in the Paris household. She had no independent legal standing, no community support network, and no ability to resist interrogation in any meaningful way. Sarah Good was impoverished. Contemporary records describe her as a beggar dependent on the charity of neighbors, someone who had already accumulated social friction through her circumstances and her manner. Sarah Osborne had been absent from church for over a year, had a contested marriage that had generated local gossip, and was elderly and ill. These were not random targets. They were the people a frightened community could most easily imagine as dangerous without disrupting its core social structures. They sat at the edges of Salem Village's respectability in different ways, and that marginality made them plausible suspects within the logic their neighbors were applying. Their examinations before magistrates John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin began on March 1st. Good denied everything. Osborne denied everything. Both were committed to custody anyway, because the afflicted girls present at the examination reportedly fell into fits when the accused looked at them, which the magistrates treated as evidence of guilt. Osborne would die in prison before any trial. Good would eventually hang. Tituba did not deny. This is the moment that changed everything, and it is the moment the popular version almost always gets wrong. Tituba's confession was not a simple admission of guilt. It was an elaborate, extended account of a wider conspiracy. She described the devil appearing to her. She described a book that witches signed. She described other witches, shadowy figures she could not fully identify. She gave the magistrates exactly what the framework of their beliefs told them to look for, evidence not of one isolated witch, but of an organized satanic network operating inside the colony. And the magistrates recorded it carefully because it confirmed what their theology had already prepared them to believe. Here is the piece of this that the popular story buries. Tituba's confession did not just explain the affliction of 2 children in one household, it transformed the entire crisis. Before Tituba spoke, Salem Village had a local mystery. After she spoke, Massachusetts Bay Colony had a conspiracy. Why did Tituba confess? The surviving record does not tell us fully. She was enslaved, she was being interrogated under conditions we would now recognize as coercive, and she had no meaningful ability to resist. One possibility is that she told the magistrates what she understood they wanted to hear. Another is that she drew on folk beliefs from her own background that she genuinely held. The surviving record does not establish her internal state, and anyone who tells you they know exactly why she said what she said is going beyond the evidence. What the record does show clearly is what her confession produced. Good and Osborne had denied. They remained imprisoned. Tituba confessed and named others. She remained imprisoned too, but she was not executed. That asymmetry was now embedded in the logic of the crisis. Denial did not protect you. Confession, at least, bought time. The afflictions continued. New accusers emerged. And the question hanging over Salem Village by the end of March 1692 was the one Tituba's confession had placed there. If there was a satanic conspiracy operating in this community, who else was part of it? That question had an answer forming, and it was going to destroy the comfortable assumption that this was a problem confined to the social margins. The next person accused was a woman who had publicly questioned whether the afflicted girls were really bewitched. Her name was Martha Corey. and she was a full communicant member of the Salem Village Church. When the warrant for her examination was issued, something shifted in the nature of the crisis that most people watching from a distance did not yet understand. But the records make the consequence impossible to ignore. The accusation against Martha Corey did not just add another name to a list. It changed what the list meant. Until that point, a nervous observer could tell themselves that the accusations followed a certain logic, that the people named were on the fringes, that the community was identifying genuine threats from its weakest and most suspicious members. Martha Corey removed that comfort. She was church-going, respectable, embedded in the community's religious life. She had skepticism about the whole affair, and she had expressed it openly. That skepticism, in the court's emerging logic, became evidence against her. If you doubted the reality of the conspiracy, perhaps it was because you were part of it. Rebecca Nurse was accused shortly after. She was 71 years old. She had been a church member for years, was widely regarded as devout, and her family was one of the more prosperous in the area. At her examination, she was so hard of hearing that she sometimes failed to respond to questions, and the afflicted girls present screamed and convulsed each time the magistrates looked her way. A jury initially acquitted her. The presiding judge sent them back to reconsider. They returned a guilty verdict. Rebecca Nurse was excommunicated from her church and hanged on July 19, 1692, when a devout, elderly, well-regarded church member could be convicted of witchcraft on the testimony of afflicted accusers. The boundaries of suspicion had effectively dissolved. There was no longer a profile that protected you, and the court that was making these decisions had been constructed specifically to handle this crisis. Governor William Phipps established the Court of Oyer and Terminer in May 1692 after arriving in Massachusetts with the colony's new charter. The colony had been in legal and political limbo. Its original charter had been revoked years earlier, leaving its government uncertain and its courts in a state of ambiguity. Phipps needed to resolve the rapidly growing crisis of imprisoned accused witches, and the special court was his solution. He appointed William Stoughton as chief judge. Stoughton was not a lawyer by training, but a committed Puritan who believed deeply in the reality of the satanic threat. The court he led would prove willing to admit evidence that was, even by the standards of some contemporaries, profoundly questionable. The most contested issue was spectral evidence. The theory was that the devil could only use a person's specter, their invisible spiritual form, with that person's permission. Therefore, if an afflicted person reported being attacked by the invisible specter of someone, that attack was taken as evidence that the accused had willingly given the devil access to their form. The accused's actual physical body could be in another location entirely. It didn't matter. The specter was them, the attack was theirs. The problems with this logic were recognized even in 1692. If the specter could only operate with the person's consent, then spectral evidence was genuinely incriminating. But some ministers, including Increase Mather, pointed out an alternative. What if the devil could use an innocent person's form without their consent? In that case, spectral evidence proved nothing. The court acknowledged this objection and then continued using spectral evidence anyway, alongside other evidence that included confessions, reports of past misfortune attributed to the accused, and physical examinations of accused people's bodies looking for what were called witches' marks. None of this evidence would satisfy a modern legal standard. Some of it should not have satisfied a 17th century legal standard either. But the court had been assembled under pressure was being led by a man who believed the colony faced a genuine supernatural emergency and was operating within a theological framework in which the stakes of failing to identify real witches were considered catastrophic. The first person the court of Oyer and Terminer executed was Bridget Bishop, hanged on June 10, 1992. Bishop had a prior history of witchcraft accusations from years earlier, charges that had not resulted in conviction, and she was seen as socially unconventional. Her execution established the court's willingness to act. By the end of the summer, it had acted many more times. Here is the mechanism that made the crisis self-sustaining. And this is the part that I find genuinely disturbing when I look at the court records directly. Confession meant you were not immediately executed. More than that, a confessor who named additional witches became useful to the court. They became a source of new suspects, a validation of the conspiracy scale, a witness against other accused people. The court needed confessors. Confessors needed the court's mercy. That mutual dependence created an incentive that the court's design built directly into the proceedings. Denial, on the other hand, marked you as uncooperative. It did not protect you. Several of the people who maintained their innocence most firmly were executed, while many of those who confessed, even those who confessed to things they had demonstrably not done, survived. The record shows this pattern clearly. It was not a secret at the time. People inside the Salem jail knew that confessing offered a path away from the gallows that maintaining innocence did not. And some of them said so explicitly in letters and petitions that survive. John Proctor understood this dynamic and hated it. He was a prosperous farmer and tavern keeper who had initially been skeptical of the whole affair. His wife Elizabeth was accused, and when he defended her publicly and challenged the accusers, he was accused himself. From prison, Proctor wrote a petition to Boston ministers objecting to the court's procedures, specifically to confessions obtained under duress and to the use of spectral evidence. He pointed out that several of the confessors had recanted privately, saying they had confessed falsely to avoid death, and that the court was not interested in hearing those recantations. Proctor's petition circulated. It did not save him. He was hanged on August 19th, 1992. Giles Corey was Martha Corey's husband, and his death was different from all the others. When the court moved to try him, Corey refused to enter a plea. He stood mute. Under English law, a defendant who refused to plead could not be tried, but they could be subjected to a process called pressing, heavy stones placed on the body until the defendant either agreed to plead or died. Corey knew this. He also knew that entering a plea and being convicted would allow the court to seize his estate, leaving his heirs with nothing. By dying under pressing, which he did over the course of 2 days on September 19th, 1992, Corey preserved his property for his family. His last recorded words, according to contemporary accounts, were a request for more weight. That act of defiance, born partly of legal strategy and partly of something that looks like deliberate refusal to grant the court the legitimacy of a trial, sits at the edge of what the surviving record can fully explain. But what it illustrates is that people inside this crisis were not passive. They were making choices, calculating risks, trying to find any available space to resist a system that had closed off most of the obvious exits. The scale by late summer was staggering. Accusations had spread into roughly 24 Massachusetts communities beyond Salem Village. Roughly 150 to 200 people were imprisoned across the colony. The accused included men, children, and people from entirely different social positions than the original targets. One of the most striking cases was George Burroughs, a former minister of Salem village who had left under difficult circumstances years earlier. Burroughs was accused of being the devil's agent, essentially the ringleader of the entire conspiracy. He was brought back to Massachusetts, tried, and condemned. At his execution on August 19th, 1692, he recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly and without hesitation. Under contemporary demonological theory, a witch was supposed to be unable to do this. Several witnesses, including the Puritan minister Cotton Mather, who was present, noted the crowd's visible unease. Mather reportedly addressed the crowd and argued that the devil could disguise himself as an innocent person and that the court's judgment should stand. Burroughs was hanged. That moment, the perfect recitation, the wavering crowd, the minister's intervention, is not a secret buried in obscure archives. It was recorded by multiple contemporaries, and it points toward a problem the court had been accumulating for months without fully acknowledging. The evidence it was using to identify witches was not reliably distinguishing the guilty from the innocent, if that distinction even mapped onto what was actually happening. The machine was generating convictions. Whether it was identifying anything real was a question that was becoming harder to ignore. The answer to that question was going to come from an unexpected direction, not from the accused, not from the lawyers, but from the ministers and officials who had either supported the court or stayed quiet while it operated, and who were about to discover that the logic they had sanctioned was now pointed at people they could not afford to lose. The accusations did not stop at farmers, elderly grandmothers, or former ministers. By the late summer of 1692, they had reached people whose position made their prosecution genuinely dangerous to the colony's leadership. Lady Phipps, the governor's wife, was named. So were prominent Boston merchants and figures connected to the colonial government. The court had been built on the premise that it could identify a conspiracy operating within Massachusetts, and now the conspiracy, according to its own accusers, apparently extended into the highest levels of colonial society. This created a problem that spectral evidence could not solve, because the people now being named had the social standing, the legal connections, and the access to powerful ministers that earlier accused people had lacked. When Rebecca Nurse had been accused, her family had fought hard and gathered a petition of 39 neighbors attesting to her character, and she had still been convicted and hanged. But the accumulation of prominent names in the accusation pool forced a reckoning that individual cases had not been able to produce. Increase Mather, one of the most influential Puritan ministers in Massachusetts, had been watching the proceedings with growing unease. In October 1692, he completed a manuscript that would be published as Cases of Conscience Concerning Evil Spirits. His argument was direct. Spectral evidence was insufficient basis for conviction because the devil might be capable of assuming an innocent person's shape without their consent. More than that, he articulated a principle that went to the heart of the court's operating logic, that it was better for 10 guilty people to escape punishment than for one innocent person to be condemned. That formulation was not new in legal philosophy, but applying it to Salem meant acknowledging that the court's evidence standard had been wrong from the beginning. Governor Phipps dissolved the Court of Oyez and Terminer on October 29, 1692. The timing matters. The court did not stop because it had run out of accused people. There were still over 100 people in custody waiting for trial. It stopped because the people with the authority to stop it finally used that authority. And the question worth sitting with is what changed between May and October that had not changed earlier. The evidence had been contested from nearly the beginning. John Proctor's petition questioning confessions, obtained under duress had been circulating since August. The doubts about spectral evidence were not new in October. What changed was the social position of the accused, the public statements of powerful ministers, and the growing recognition that the court was threatening to consume the colony's own leadership structure. The Superior Court of Judicature that replaced it began hearing witchcraft cases in January 1693. The new court's approach to spectral evidence was fundamentally different. It was no longer treated as reliable proof of guilt. The result was immediate and stark. Of the remaining cases tried, the overwhelming majority ended in acquittal. Governor Phipps eventually ordered the release of those still imprisoned, including people who had already been convicted under the old court standards. The accused had not changed. The evidence had not changed. Only the court's willingness to treat that evidence as sufficient had changed, and that shift alone collapsed the prosecution. That fact should stop you for a moment. 19 people were hanged. 1 was pressed to death. Others died in custody. And the legal mechanism that produced those deaths was dismantled, not because it was proven wrong in some fundamental theological sense, but because the people running the colony decided to change the evidentiary standard. The same accusations, the same testimony, the same afflicted witnesses. Under the new standard, they convicted no one. The aftermath unfolded slowly and incompletely. Samuel Sewell, one of the judges who had served on the court of Oyer and Terminer, stood before his congregation in Boston's Old South Church in January 1697 and had a statement read aloud on his behalf. In it, he accepted personal blame and shame for his role in the proceedings and asked forgiveness from God and from the community. He was the only judge to make such a public acknowledgement. The others were largely silent on the subject. The jurors who had returned guilty verdicts signed a statement acknowledging that they had been deceived and that their decisions had resulted in the deaths of innocent people. Several of the confessors later formally recanted, stating that they had confessed falsely under extreme pressure. Their recantations were accepted quietly. No serious effort was made to examine what those coerced confessions had cost the people they had named. Ann Putnam Jr. was 12 years old in 1692. She had been one of the most active accusers, naming multiple people whose executions followed. In 1706, when she sought to become a full member of the Salem Village Church, she read a public statement of apology. She was the only one of the original accusers to do so. Her statement attributed her actions to a combination of her own youth, what she described as a great delusion of Satan, and the behavior of an evil instrument. She did not claim full personal responsibility, and historians continue to debate what the appropriate weight of individual accountability looks like for a 12-year-old operating inside the pressure of that system. The surviving record does not tell us with certainty what Ann Putnam experienced or understood in 1692. What it does show is that she lived with it for 14 years before she said anything public about it. Massachusetts took much longer to acknowledge the full scope of what had happened. The legislature passed a bill in 1711 reversing the attainders of many of those convicted, but the compensation was partial and the reversal incomplete. Several of the condemned were not included. The legal cloud over some of those convicted in 1692 was not fully lifted until 2001, when the state legislature passed a resolution clearing the remaining names. The last names were formally exonerated by a legislative act in 2022, 330 years after the executions. This is where the popular version's explanation, mass hysteria, malicious girls, an inexplicably crazy town, breaks down completely. Mass hysteria does not take 3 centuries to apologize for. Deliberate fraud does not produce the legal machinery the surviving records describe. And an entire community does not go crazy and then simply return to normal once a governor changes an evidentiary standard. What the contemporary records show, read together, is something considerably more uncomfortable. The people who drove the Salem crisis forward, the magistrates, the judges, the ministers who supported the court, the accusers who provided testimony, were operating within a framework they considered entirely rational. Puritan theology held that Satan was real, active, and specifically interested in destroying the communities of the godly. That was not a fringe belief, it was institutional doctrine. The idea that witches could harm people through supernatural means was embedded in English law, Puritan theology, and the educated assumptions of the colony's leadership. When a physician said 2 children were suffering from an evil hand, he was applying his professional framework to symptoms he could not otherwise explain. When magistrates admitted spectral evidence, they were following a theological theory about how the devil operated. When confessors named additional conspirators, they were giving the court the thing the court's theory told it to look for. The crisis was self-sustaining because the system had been designed, without anyone fully intending this, to make accusation safe and denial dangerous. Confess and name others. You survive, at least for now. Deny. The court treats your denial as further evidence of your guilt, because of course a witch would deny being a witch. Refuse to participate at all, as Giles Corey did. The court has a procedure for that too, and it kills you more slowly. Modern scholars have proposed various contributing factors. Mary Beth Norton's influential argument that the crisis cannot be understood without accounting for the trauma of frontier warfare, with multiple accusers and their families having experienced the violence of conflict with indigenous peoples on the northern New England frontier, living as refugees in a colony that was simultaneously losing battles and struggling to explain why God was allowing it to suffer. That psychological and theological pressure, Norton argues, made the idea of a satanic conspiracy operating from within the colony, not paranoid, but theologically necessary, an explanation for catastrophe that located the threat in a place where something could be done about it. Other historians have pointed to long-standing property disputes, family conflicts, and political divisions within Salem Village that shaped who accused whom. None of these factors alone explains the crisis, and none of them together produces a clean, singular cause. The surviving record does not offer one, and the honest answer is that it probably never will. What the record does establish is the mechanism, and the mechanism is what makes Salem genuinely frightening in a way that mass hysteria never quite manages to be, because mass hysteria implies something outside of human agency, a kind of collective madness that descends and then lifts. The Salem records show human beings making decisions, institutions making choices, a legal system operating according to rules it had been given and applying them with lethal consistency. The Court of Oye in Terminer was not a mob, it was a court. It kept records. Its judges signed their names to execution orders. Its procedures had an internal logic. And that logic, applied faithfully, killed 19 people in less than 4 months. The darkest secret Salem has been carrying for 300 years is not that a town lost its mind. It is that the town did not lose its mind. The people who built and operated that court believed they were protecting their community from a genuine supernatural threat, applying legitimate legal procedures, and fulfilling their religious obligations. Remove any one of 3 things: spectral evidence as admissible proof, the incentive structure that rewarded confession and punished denial, or the theological framework that made a satanic conspiracy not just possible, but expected, and the crisis likely collapses much earlier than it did. None of those 3 things required madness to exist. They required institutions, beliefs, and incentives that were already present in the colony before January 1692. Ann Putnam Jr. stood before her congregation in 1706 and read her apology aloud, and the church accepted it and made her a member. The 19 people whose deaths her testimony had helped produce were buried in graves that their families were sometimes not permitted to mark properly because the executed had been considered criminals. Some of those graves have never been definitively located. The compensation paid to surviving families in 1711 ranged from small sums to nothing at all, depending on how well the family had been able to document their case to a legislature that had already moved on. The colony that had built the machine was not especially interested in examining how the machine had worked, because examining it carefully would have required acknowledging that the machine had been built from materials that were still very much present: institutional authority, sincere belief, and a legal structure that made the most dangerous thing a person could do. Inside it was to insist clearly and consistently that they were innocent.